Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Pierre. I do apologize. Slight technical issue making you pad that. So, as Pierre said, my name is Sally Jenkinson, and it is such a real pleasure to be back again after last year. So I do apologize for those of you who have to sit through 2 of my talks, but hopefully this will be interesting. And I work as a freelance consultant, as you've heard, through my company, and basically provide all sorts of services from discovery-based stuff through to solutions architecture and more strategic services around processes and teams and things like that, and not meetings, but possibly that might be a future thing to look at, obviously. But basically, I help people to kind of understand what they need to do and how to technically make that happen. But I'm here today to talk to you about something completely different, which is the idea of open data. And data is a term that you obviously hear a lot within the world that we work in. And it can basically be defined as a set of qualitative or quantitative variables, and it's these individual facts or statistics that can be collected together and analyzed in order to produce some information. And sometimes data can get confused with content, although there is this really strong relationship between the two. Broadly speaking, content is things like a news article or an image or a video, but data is the facts and the statistics that underpin these things. And sometimes data can end up influencing content, and sometimes content may influence data. So, say a summary of votes in elections would be data, but you might get something like a news report being written about that, and then the page views of how many people read those news stories may be data again. And data forms a huge part of many of our projects. And often we tend to think about it in the context of something really confined, like Google Analytics, but actually we may collect it directly and store it within our applications, or we may expose it, or we may ingest it from third parties, or it actually may inspire content, as we've heard. And even really simple sites can have a lot of data flying around. So we might have things like address-based services that we use, maybe to help with address completion or verification or standardization. And that's obviously a call to a third-party data set. But then we might do a call again to do some geocoding so that we can get the latitude and longitude so that we can map our address data effectively. And we might augment that with other information, so maybe the tax rate for the company the country that we're looking at, or even perhaps put together things like content from somewhere like Flickr, or perhaps some stats from Foursquare, for instance. And this is all pretty typical stuff. So, of course, everything now also seems to have a dashboard or analytics to view, because people are really interested in data. And it's become pretty hot over the last 10 or so years, and I'm sure that trends like this on some of the buzzword terms are absolutely no surprise to you. But I personally love data, and it's not always directly part of my job, but I find it particularly fascinating. And I can see that through some of the ways that I interact with sites as well. So I obviously use Google Analytics for my personal website and things that I do. And if I so choose to, I can see which of my tweets are popular or otherwise through Twitter's analytics. And my Last.fm profile shows an overview of assorted data about what I've been listening to over the last 10 years, or more accurately, it shows the kind of devices that I've been listening on or the services that I've used, and obviously how that correlates to what was actually being scrobbled or not. And I myself put data out there, so I've got my utterly pointless and sadly soon-to-be retired tea tracker page, which pointlessly details my tea drinking habits since November 2013. And I make slightly more potentially useful stuff with other people's data as well, like using the Marvel API to find out which are the most popular characters by the numbers of times they've appeared in individual comics or series or stories or events. So, yeah, useful stuff. But I'm sure, like me, when you are making your pointless things, you probably found yourself potentially being limited by some of these data providers or bound by terms that maybe don't meet your specific needs. Because many of the data services that we use have these very strict terms and conditions around usage, and can be prohibitive in many different ways. So they can end up locking off data or limiting what we can do with it. And the Twitter API is obviously really notorious for this, and especially with changing over time. But if we go back to the Marvel API, for instance, this states that you can actually only use their data for non-commercial applications. And anytime any of the Marvel data appears on screen, it has to be accompanied by a Marvel copyright notice and a link back to Marvel's own site. And the delivery mechanism is also limited because it's free at the moment, but it reserves the right to charge at any time in the future. And it's also rate limited to 1,000 API calls per day. So this isn't the most stringent of limitations, but it's an example of how actually the data provider is restricting what you can do with it, how you present it, and also how you can get it. So this is an example of data sharing, which is the release of data for restricted purposes to selected people or organizations. And a couple of examples are things like the data that your loyalty schemes, maybe a supermarket loyalty scheme, might collect on you, and that may be shared internally or with their select partners so that they can, market appropriate things to you. Or the electoral register, for example. So you can get at this data, but you're very limited by the ways that you can get it and what you can do with it. So we can't always get our hands on the data that we necessarily want. And if we can, sometimes we're restricted by whoever has put it out there. And the idea is that by using open data, your consumption and your analysis and your presentation of data shouldn't actually be controlled by the data provider. So this leaves you free to use it in ways that may not have been anticipated, or which allow subsequent works to build on what you're doing as well. So what is it that actually makes data open? So that we've got this shared understanding, because it's something that I think people often misunderstand slightly. This is a definition, and it's one of the most popular ones, and it's housed at opendefinition.org. And as you can see, there is a really detailed explanation of all of the key points, but it can be summed up as open data and content can be freely used, modified, and shared by anyone for any purpose. So this isn't a new concept, but it's one that goes against many of the more traditional attitudes of how we approach data on the web. And it's something which we're finding is being more and more standardized as time is going on. So with open data, the idea is that you give people freedom so they can work with the data without restrictions from copyrights or patents or other mechanisms of control. And through opening up your data, you could allow people to republish the content or data on their own website. They could derive new content or data from yours. They could make money by selling products that use your content or data. Or they could even charge a fee for accessing the data. And these two last points are really important to understand because the data itself should meet all of the criteria of being open and being able to be used for anything by anybody. But you may potentially choose a delivery service with a commercial aspect, such as an API that requires registration or has different paid-for levels of access. So open data does not necessarily mean free APIs with access for everybody to do whatever they want. And when we talk about open data, one of the really important other things to consider is that we can both consume it and publish it. So a lot of data is being published and consumed out there at the moment. So key people are Music Brains, which is an open music encyclopedia. And we've got DBpedia, which essentially makes the contents of Wikipedia available in RDF format and also incorporates links to other datasets on the web. And in the UK, we've got data.gov.uk, which is a collection of datasets available from all UK central government departments and a number of other public sector bodies and local authorities. And there are plenty more spanning absolutely everything. So when I put together this talk, I started to collect together things that I thought might be interesting. But then, as always happens, I happened to find this excellent list of public datasets. So just use that instead. But these aren't all actually open. They have a range of different kind of licenses and restrictions, but you've got everything there from NASA data through to internet data, through to earthquake archives, through to a data set of 10,000 cat images and their associated attributes. So if you want to make really pointless things like me, there's probably something there for you as well. But you're probably starting to get the picture that a lot of this comes down to licensing, and you'd be right. So open data itself is a set of principles, and it's not any one individual license. But all of the following can apply when we think about content and data being open. So these are some open licenses for content, and no doubt you've probably come across some of these. So we've got things like public domain, or potentially might involve some attribution there. And you also get open licenses for databases. So these are the kind of things you want to look out there. And there are other licenses as well that enable reuse and which you may encounter, particularly around public sector information. So the Open Government License is an attribution license that covers both copyright and database right. And it's mainly used for information made available by the UK central government. And you've got OS open licenses, which is, again, an attribution license that's pretty much exactly the same, but it ensures the attribution is to the Ordnance Survey. So all in all, it's a pretty simple concept. But why would you actually want to use or publish data openly? So the economic impact of opening data up so that people can do whatever they want to do with it has been the subject of several recent studies, and it showed benefits both in terms of generating value and to promote cost savings. And you get stats like there was a 2013 McKinsey and Company report which estimated that open data could generate $3 trillion in additional value per year across 7 different sectors. And there are a number of these kind of stats flying around which show fantastic value could be achieved and also cost savings. Now, obviously, one of the benefits of opening up your data and putting it out there for people to analyze and pick apart is transparency. And I actually added in the following slide after something that Anna Debenham said the other night when we were talking. And she read a book called Thinking in Systems, which has a bit about how in 1986 there was new federal legislation which required US companies to report all chemical emissions from each of their plants. And this became publicly available through Freedom of Information Acts. And many of these emissions that people were putting out there weren't actually illegal and they weren't breaking any limits, but you started to get reporters accessing that data and putting out stories like the top 10 polluters. And within 2 years, because of the fact that people were gaining notice of this information and were using it, the nationwide emissions had actually decreased by 40%. So transparency isn't just about access. It's not just about putting something out there and saying, I'm transparent, my data's out there. But it's about giving people the ability to do things, to analyze it, and to reuse the data. Because often, to really understand data, it needs to be analyzed and visualized, and this requires that the material be open enough so that it can be freely used and reused. So often when data is released or used in ways that it's not originally gathered for, it quickly becomes apparent where there's potential for efficiencies or greater effectiveness. So opening up your data for analysis can help with measurement through the ability to visualize and interpret patterns, especially when it's used in conjunction with other data sets. And the chemical emission data being available through Freedom of Information requests is one matter, but actually making that open by default would be much better. So a project that I worked on last year identified that a huge amount of time and effort was being put into answering similar kind of Freedom of Information Act requests, whereas actually if that information had been available openly to people, then they wouldn't have had to spend that time on answering and processing each request. Now, people are also solving their own quite niche problems through the use of open data. So because there's this huge range of information out there, people like a Danish lady, Tina Müller, she was able to build a service called Find Toilet, which allows people who have weaker bladders to have confidence in exploring cities that they may not know because they always want to make sure that they have toilets around them. So that's quite a specific problem. But obviously, it's not just people solving problems for themselves. So data is this key resource in the modern age. And the more that we can release it, or the more that we have the ability to consume and process and analyze it without limitations, the more likely it will be that innovative new products and services can really thrive. So finally, by having the freedom to reuse data sets and to combine data sets with others, we can gain some great insight into solving problems, which brings us nicely onto a related subject, which is linked data, another data term. And there's a great TED talk by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, which you can find amongst other places on data.gov.uk, where he talks about the growth of the internet and how he asked us all to put our documents on the web, which we obviously did. And now he wants us to do the same with our data. But the important thing is to maintain this concept of the humble hyperlink and these infinite navigable journeys that we can go on with our documents. He wants us to do exactly the same with our data. It's not just about having these individual silos of data. The more that we can actually link them up, and the more that we can see what we can do with them combined, you can forge these fantastic relationships, and the power that you have can therefore grow. And the principle is a really powerful one, and it's gained quite a lot of traction since it first came to prominence in 2009. When you start to view datasets as being linkable, you build up this picture of the amazing resource that we potentially have. But of course, as you can see from this diagram, where there's great potential to combine data, there's also great potential for things to get extremely messy. And this is where standards obviously come in. So the concept of linked data is in itself a standard, and it's essentially a set of best practices for publishing and connecting structured data on the web. And it comes with some guidelines for how best to approach this. So the key technologies that you want to be looking at are using URIs as generic identifiers for entities and concepts, and of course as HTTP for requesting or receiving data, as you'd probably expect. And the key is to use RDF in particular, which is a generic graph-based data model with which to structure and link data that describes things in the world. So the basic principles are that you use an RDF data model to publish structured data on the web, and then you use RDF links to interlink data from different sources, and carry on. So very simply, you could have one data set described in a structured way that has a semantic relationship to another one, and that, in turn, obviously has relationships to others, and so it continues. But it's all very well kind of talking about the technicalities of RDF and URIs, because obviously as computers, standards and formats are really important. But to humans, so too is context. And when it comes to giving real people understanding of the models that we're collecting, the data that we have there, we can use something called an ontology. And these are basically defined as a formal specification of a shared conceptualization, which is basically big words for starting to explain the data in understandable terms and to illustrate some of those relationships in ways that normal people can understand. So a great example of these can be seen on the BBC website again. And this is their food ontology from their ontology site. And yeah, so this is still pretty techie stuff, and you're not going to find normal people taking this to bed to read. But it does have some concepts that we can understand very simply. So I'm not sure if you can see this, but actually the diagram shows up here that you've actually got a recipe, which has got a relationship to a dessert, which has got a relationship through to a menu. So it's these relationships described in really human terms. And this is the BBC's Things site, which builds on top of the linked data and the ontologies. And what it basically does is to just slap an interface on top of all of that data and to allow people to navigate between pages for different entities and see the data, but in a very user-friendly way. So you can search in the box for a TV program, and that will show all the data that they hold on that. And then obviously you can click through using this concept of linking data through to maybe one of the actors. And you might see that they were born in a particular town. So you might go on to look at, say, the population for that town. And then maybe you want to see the weather for that town, because obviously the BBC have this amazing collection of different related data sets. So it's a great example of actually the power that you can gain when you look at things in a broader concept. So it's the human thinking coupled with the computer-centric benefits that data brings that can really help us see how you can do great things when data is made more free and more open. And I'm a big advocate of thinking about the experience that users have when you consider any kind of technical or build decision. And one of the benefits that open and linked data can bring is to be able to combine data sets in ways that answer human questions rather than being purely data-led for the sake of data. So this is what Mapumental have done, and they've created a tool that lets people find a viable part of the country to live in, based on the time that it will take them to get to work via public transport, because we think in terms of time when we kind of make these decisions rather than kilometers or miles. And the framework that they've made here can then be applied to much bigger problems as well. So they can provide a tool for planners when they think about public services, as this quote shows really well, because in Wales, you might have something that's only a few kilometers away, but actually that may take you ages to get to because of the tiny little roads or the terrain. And finally, with answering these questions that aren't easily possible from raw data, they created a tool around emergency services. So they have fire engine journey times available to plots. So again, it allows you to answer these very human-led questions, like how quickly could 4 fire engines get to a specific postcode at a certain time in the morning, or how far can an aerial appliance like a helicopter get to within 15 minutes? What's the range there? But these kind of tools and services can only really come about when there is openness and when you're not restricting how people can use your data. The more that we place restrictions, the more that we're going to see people not really realizing the full benefits. So this all sounds great. So why isn't everything open? Well, obviously, despite there being benefits, as with everything, there are usually challenges that come along. And you see quite a few counter-arguments frequently popping up, which I'm not going to try and debunk all of, because these are going to be very specific to your individual scenarios. But often, many of these negative kind of arguments towards open data and things in general are as a result of the culture that you're working in. So I think that if you have a culture that's very open in general and it's very kind of open to exploring new things as well, then it typically works better. And in a more closed culture, you're more likely to see some of these arguments. So the challenges generally fit into one of the following categories. So we've got legal problems. You have the practical issues of actually kind of gathering and releasing and using these data. You've got the technical issues that come around whether you've got the capabilities for development. And then you've also got the social impact as well. So things like the availability of support and the creation of documentation and services as well. So just to look at a few key considerations. Data may not necessarily be accurate, or it may be incomplete. And there's sometimes a view that if data is out there in the open, and especially if other people are feeding into that data, then you run the risk of that kind of becoming corrupted somehow. But the other side to that is very much, if you have a closed silo, you don't have the opportunity for people to feed in. So by actually opening it up, you gain this great advantage. There's also the cost of sharing data and the processes around that. And this is not only in terms of cleaning and releasing the data itself, but there is often this worry that you will hear in terms of perceived business impact, because if everybody has the same data that I have, what's to stop them from doing exactly what I want to do with the data? And sometimes you have companies who are potentially forced to put some data out there, but there's a limit to how far they go because they don't actually want to be encouraging their customers to have visibility. So energy companies, for instance, they might have to sort of talk about people saving money and saving energy to a certain level, but when it comes down to it, there may be conflicts of interest there. So much of the information gathered online or held by companies is around individuals, especially with the way that we kind of interact with services nowadays. And true anonymization of personal information is notoriously difficult to do very safely. And as such, this usually means that open data does not necessarily relate directly to individuals. And where it does, it's usually aggregated statistics, so things like the the census, for instance. And the exception here is when data is made available by the individual themselves. So if I was to release my tea drinking data, for instance, or if there's explicit consent of the affected individuals, or where there's a mandatory reason to do so. And an interesting case study here is in Scandinavia. Everybody's tax return data is actually available openly online. So it's everybody from your neighbor next door to your colleagues to politicians and celebrities. It's all out there. And of course, this provides some really useful information because you can make sure that there's no gender disparity in companies, or that you can provide people with market research so that they actually know what they are worth. But in the UK, I know that it's something that we would really not be very comfortable with. And what we've seen is in Scandinavia, they've actually kind of pulled back a little bit of how open it was in order to protect more of the individual's rights. And one concern held by many is the lack of a central authority or way of accessing all open data. So if you will, the discovery and the access to everything that's out there. And several key sites have been set up, so there are a lot of sort of portal sites which link you out to lots of things, and obviously, as we've seen, people are collecting together their own sets. But organizations really want to know that if they're going to take the time and the effort to put data out there, that people are going to be able to use it and find it. And similarly, just everyday people, so you and me, it's sometimes difficult to know where to go to and which data sets are the best if you are looking for specific open data sets. So as we've heard previously, interoperability and combining data sets is really key to making the most of data. And some of the challenges lie around compatible licensing and a potential misunderstanding of openness. So you might have used some data in your project that potentially required attribution. And so you might have been really good and attributed it properly. But then what you might have done is to build on that and to create something that is more than the original data set. What you might want to do then is to release that completely freely and openly in the public domain. And what this would obviously do is allow people to do whatever they want with it. But that would contradict the original requirement for attribution. So you start to find these conflicts sometimes, and it can be quite tricky when you are trying to kind of combine lots of different data sets or with different levels of openness. So there's a really useful tool down here at the bottom which can help you guide your thinking on those matters and to plan what you're going to do. And so finally, one of the arguments against releasing data openly is that people can do whatever they like with it, which is obviously the point. But as with everything, if people want to use something poorly, then they will, whether it is through misinterpretation or deliberate misrepresentation, or potentially malicious purposes being possible due to the lack of restrictions. But very often, this is going to happen anyway, regardless of your licensing. And when we think in the context of linking, some scientists have argued against this because data collected under different conditions may not always be compatible. And we've all no doubt seen some wonderful examples of just how wrong data can go when it's taken out of its proper context. So you start to see patterns like this, for instance. So let's look at what it actually means to involve some open principles in our projects. So consumption of open data is pretty straightforward, and it can work two ways. So either you're going to identify a need, and you can probably find some open data to meet it, or you might actually find some interesting data and want to do some more analysis or build something from that as a starting point. So key points to think about when you're at this point of the project is to identify some data that has an appropriate license, as we've seen, and that gives you the freedom to do what you want, and that is also compatible with any other data sets that you might find. And we want to make sure that the data is of a good quality and level of detail for our needs. So I'm going to come on to this in a sec when we talk about publishing. But once it actually comes to getting that open data, you're commonly going to be working with formats that you're already used to. So it's all the things that you know and love, like CSV, JSON, RDF, and XML. So there's nothing hugely special here. It's just getting data that has more freedom than maybe some of the other data you've worked with. And you might be downloading that data periodically, or it might potentially give you access via an API. Now, it's important to consider that some people talk about releasing data openly, but you later find out that this is some data that's been put out there in something like a PDF, which obviously isn't very desirable because it's not structured or easily machine readable in the same way as, say, JSON is. So you need to watch out for that if people are kind of saying one thing, but actually the format can be slightly limiting. And then once you've grabbed the data, there are loads of different ways to visualize it. So you've got libraries like D3 being incredibly popular. But when you're doing this, you also need to think about how visual the data actually needs to be, because not everything needs to be put into a dashboard. It may actually be that it's a bit more functional than this. So the examples that we had at the start, for example, were very much background calls. So there's going to be a different level of how much of this data actually gets surfaced. So when we're putting together our presentation, we obviously need to think about using standard-based web technologies if we're presenting on the web, and we want everything to be really performant, as we just heard, which can sometimes be tricky when you are working with particularly large data sets. And we want to make sure that it is accessible to people. So using progressive enhancement and all of the good things that we know about are really good to do. And also, if you're going to be augmenting and re-releasing the data itself, then you should actually have an option to let people grab that data that you're re-releasing directly in order to promote that reuse. So you don't want people to have to kind of scrape it out of your JavaScript or anything like that. But whilst most of my focus today is obviously on the web, because that's kind of what we do day to day, you don't just have to work with open data in digital ways. So people are actually using open principles in conjunction with the physical world and to create pieces of art. Because by opening up your data to any use, you can actually get some amazing interpretations through different formats that were never originally intended. So as a kind of halfway house between digital and physical, we've got schemes such as open sensors, which aim to take the enthusiasm for the Internet of Things and to encourage the publication of open data within physical projects through the provision of a platform which facilitates that. So you've got things like environmental sensing projects run by communities to monitor things like local air or water quality. And through using the platform, you can start to combine that with other data sets, potentially real-time ones or historical ones. And again, it gives you that great analysis potential. But taking it further into the realms of purely physical, there's a guy called Doug McCune who's doing some amazing stuff. And what he does is he takes open data, but he takes the most horrible, nasty data and subject matter that he can find, and he aims to turn that into something beautiful. And I think that Doug's relationship with open data is particularly interesting because he has a talk that he does, which is it's titled Desperately Trying to Remove the Air Quotes Around the Word Artist, which documents his shift in identity from being a developer who works with data through to him considering himself actually an artist. So he's got pieces including a drunk traffic map of Portland DUIs, which is a print of the number of driving under the influence arrests along each street in Portland over the course of 10 years. He's got a Haiti earthquake tree trunk map, which represents the January 2010 earthquake, and it's laser cut out of different kinds of bamboo and shows the shake intensity data that radiates out of the epicenter. And similarly, he's got a 3D print of the 2014 South Napa earthquake, and the data here represents the peak ground velocity, which is a measure of how intense the ground shaking was, which is really closely related to damage. And I think my favorite one is the Bay Area homicide constellation map, which is a map of murders throughout the Bay Area. Lovely. And what he's done here is he's formed these sort of constellations by connecting homicides from 2013 that are in close geographic proximity to one another. And he's dotted around the homicides for 2014 to give a bit more context as well. And you've also got Stephanie, who I know has been doing a few talks about this recently, and she works with a range of open data. But the project that I want to show you is something called Air Transformed, and it focuses on posing the question, what if we could really see and feel the burden that air pollution places on our bodies? And what she's done here is to create a series of, as she calls them, wearable data objects. So they're essentially kind of almost like pieces of jewelry. And they aim to communicate the physical burden that air pollution can cause on our bodies. And so she's taken open data from Sheffield, which is a notorious kind of steel-making town, very industrialized in the north of the UK. And what she's done is to break that down and to categorize it using both shapes and colors. So you've got a scale ranging from green, very friendly, through to red, and the different shapes at the top there. And what you end up with is something like this. So you've got the week of the Christmas period, so lots of friendly shapes, very round, lots of greens and blues. And that can compare nicely to Bonfire Week, where you see this very instantly obvious spike. So it gives you this impression of the physical impact, and also, obviously, the colors really draw your eye to it. So that's consuming. But publishing data or open data is slightly more complex due to the responsibilities required to do it well. So there are numerous guides online by people like the Open Data Institute in the UK if you are interested in doing it, but we can simplify it down into a few key steps. So you need to put together some really clear licensing and usage information so that people know how they can and can't use your data. You should put together a plan for support, because data that's just put out there likely isn't going to be maintained very well, and it's not going to be desirable to people in the future. And thirdly, you want to make sure that the structure and the quality of the data are really good. So data should be cleaned and formatted in a logical structure and presented as machine readable. And so the first step, of course, is to identify what data you've got and what you want to put out there. And this is probably going to involve an assessment of what data you've personally or what your organization has got and what quality that's at, and to also plan these processes that are going to be involved in how you actually get that through to publication. So many organizations do start with the data that they have that's kind of trapped. So I mentioned that people sometimes take PDFs and put them out there as, we're being open. But actually what you can do here is to take that information and start to structure it and apply a delivery mechanism that's slightly better than simply putting files out there. But an important thing to remember here is that when you are starting to make information open, we've talked about the license, and so people may package up their data, put an appropriate license there next to it, but actually it's housed within their own website, which has really generic, restrictive terms and conditions that everybody has as standard in their footer. So you need to be aware of kind of the big picture and how it fits into that as well. But it's, of course, not just about technology, but it's about people too. So you need to think about the management and support and your ongoing strategy. And these are all incredibly important to define up front and to discuss. And your capabilities to actually release data effectively in any format are really important to be honest about right at the start of a project if you are looking to get into this. So once the data has been identified, you might want to do an extract or a compilation, so particularly if you have individuals' data to be considerate about. And there are many, many tools available to help you with extracting and with cleaning your data. So OpenRefine is one that's very commonly used to clean and transform and even to kind of extend your data with web services. And Clean Sheet, more simply, provides some information around if you're going to put data out there in spreadsheets. And now, obviously, sharing and publication can take many forms, but ensuring that your license is very clearly stated alongside the data will aid reuse. And in terms of actually how you share it, there are a couple of schemes that are out there to provide some guidance. So the first is, again, from Sir Tim Berners-Lee, and he's put together these 5 different levels, so 5-star levels, which you can find at 5stardata.info. And so this really ranges from putting your stuff out there with an open license, however you want to do that, through to starting to structure that and make sure that it's not requiring proprietary elements, and then starting to link it up, so by housing that using its own URL and also to kind of link to other data sets as well. And aiming to give a less technical, more well-rounded view of what a good data set is, you find that there are these open data certificates which are being pioneered by the Open Data Institute in London. And these also include information around the rights and the licensing, but they also have documentation and guarantees about availability. So it's a bit more context provided, and it kind of acts as a reference sheet for people who are looking to reuse the information. So in summary, we now live in a society where information is really key, and data underpins both many of our projects and actually the way that we live our lives. So we collect it, and we use it, and sometimes we share it. And data, as with documents, is a fundamental element of the web itself. So rather than data being something which is hidden below our applications, we can really bring it to the forefront. We can make it more powerful. We can use it to gain benefits, either indirectly or directly. We can do this by thinking about how data fits into the bigger picture and potentially whether it can be linked with other data sets to enhance content. So by removing these unnecessary restrictions and promoting freedom and creativity of usage, by embracing standards and open web technologies, with better, more freely available data, society can start hopefully making better decisions, improving costs, being more creative, and sparking new innovations that would otherwise not have been possible if you had these restrictions in place. So by consuming or publishing open data, you too can help to promote it and to hopefully help the data grow. Thanks very much.